Annually, 15 million men and women in the United States alone are affected by infertility.
Isn't that wild? I had 4 miscarriages while I was trying to have our second kid. I remember going to the bookstore and looking for books on miscarriage, and the section was like a couple of inches wide. That was it. Try to refrain from saying well, at least you got pregnant if you had a miscarriage, or at least we know you can get pregnant. At least anything I feel like is really tricky and kind of triggering for people who are going through infertility, because it's I don't want to hear that. Infertility doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're a big celebrity and you've got all the money in the world. It's just something that unfortunately affects so many people.
The Big Silence, empowering personal experiences, inspiring compassion, and healing lives. We are no longer silent. We are here.
The Big Silence.
Ali Prato, welcome to the Big Silence podcast. I am excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, and as I've already mentioned in the intro I just did, you are the host of Infertile AF, the #1 infertility podcast.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to have this conversation because it's not one that people often have without, or, there's a stigma around that. And we've definitely never had this conversation on the Big Silence. So,
yeah, well, I'm happy to have it. And I'm a totally open book. So anything you want to ask, go for it.
Yeah. So let's dive in. So one of the stats that you mentioned in your pod is that annually 15 million men and women in the United States alone are affected by infertility.
Isn't that wild?
That is wild.
And the number keeps growing too. When I came into this industry and this world several years ago, the statistic was 1 in 8 couples, and now it's 1 in 6.
And it's baffling because nobody talks about it. I've had some close friends open up about it, or it's years later and they talk about it. And I think there's a big stigma around a woman or a man, and a lot of people choosing to have children later in life now. So
yeah,
what are your thoughts on that stigma, and how do we end this?
Yeah, I think that's part of it for me, with my individual story. So I had a secondary infertility journey. And I think it all goes back to the fact that I didn't start to try to have my kids until later in life. My issues ended up becoming an egg quality issue, which is an age-related issue.
Which they call geriatric.
Geriatric, yes, absolutely. That term needs to...
Can we change that term?
I've been trying. It needs to go away forever. Yeah. And, it's funny because nowadays it is talked about more, thankfully, but it's been a slow road. And, when I was in the midst of it, between my daughter, who is now 14, which is wild, and my son, who I had through IVF, who's 8 going on 9, nobody was talking about this back then.
Oh yeah.
And I certainly had friends who had gone through it, but it just wasn't something that was at the forefront of people's minds. I remember I had 4 miscarriages while I was trying to have our second kid. And I remember going to the bookstore and looking for books on miscarriage, and the section was a couple of inches wide. That was it. And I was there should be a room for all this stuff. It's so common. So
that's interesting too, because I always talk about on the podcast how when I was a kid and when my mom was diagnosed with schizophrenia, I had to go to the library, and there was 1 book. But now there's a lot more info.
Yeah.
But even backing up, because I think it's interesting too, it's not, you've been with your husband, you were high school sweethearts.
Yeah.
Vince. And,
you did your research.
I did. I know all about Vince.
Oh my God.
I know all about how you worked at Playboy, which I want to ask how that was.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. That was the best time ever.
Yeah. But you guys have been together for a long time. You were working, you decided to have children, quote unquote, later in life. Yeah. So you had your first daughter with ease, pretty easy, got pregnant within a few months.
That's right.
And I feel like that happens to a lot. And then you mentioned the secondary infertility, which is common. And I think there's a huge stigma around that as well.
Totally. So first of all, I didn't even know, I'd never heard the term secondary infertility.
Mhm.
And I don't even think, actually thinking back, that it was used while I was in the midst of it. It wasn't until later that somebody came to me and said, they wanted me to write an article for this magazine and, about my secondary infertility journey. And I was like, oh
Yeah, that's
yeah,
awesome.
what is that? I never heard that. So again, even the vernacular has changed so much. But um yeah, it definitely was a thing where, like you said, I got pregnant pretty easily with my daughter, and then, it was just loss after loss. And it was with me, it was basically like I wasn't having an issue getting pregnant. I had an issue staying pregnant, which meant when I ultimately saw a specialist and the, IVF doctor that I ended up working with, who was awesome. I got very lucky because it was just like kind of the first one we looked at, and he and I clicked, and he was wonderful, Dr. Joshua Klein. Um, he was like, this isn't, this is something that if you do IVF, you will probably have success because you've got a healthy egg reserve,
Mhm.
but you don't have a lot of, or sorry, he said you have a big egg reserve, but you don't have a lot of healthy eggs. So if we can find the healthy eggs, then we can make this work because there was nothing going on Vince's end. So,
Right.
um,
So
I don't know if I just, yeah, go ahead.
leading up to the decision for IVF and 4 miscarriages, do you feel like did the doctor say that there was anything environmental or emotional, or was there a stressful environment? Because I know sometimes, stress does a lot to our bodies.
Yes. No, he basically, so when I finally went in for the workup, it wasn't until I had had my fourth loss. And again, you asked about secondary infertility. It's one
Mhm.
of those things where you don't really know, like, am I allowed to like be as upset going through
Mhm.
secondary infertility as someone who is going through primary infertility? And I always say now, like, I don't think it matters at all. I think pain is pain, loss is loss. Secondary infertility is really, really hard, but it does kind of get and misunderstood rap, I would say, because people are like, well, you have a kid. What are why are
Right.
you putting yourself through this? And the way that I've always tried to explain it is because I did have people, not like good friends of mine, but some people were like, "You've got a daughter. Can't you just be happy with what you have?" They saw me putting my family through all this and myself through hell. And like, we can get into all the details. I'm happy to talk about any of it. But I was really depressed and my
Mhm.
marriage was really on the rocks. And, it was like the only reason that was all happening was because we were trying for the second kid. And it was mainly me, the impetus behind it, because I just felt like I wasn't done. I felt like somebody was missing and I
Mhm.
couldn't let go of that desire. And, with secondary infertility, I always try to explain it wasn't coming from a place of greed, which sometimes people try to pin on you, like,
Mhm.
oh, just be happy. You've at
Mm.
least got one kid.
Mm.
It was coming from a place of love because I love being a mom. I was surprised by how much I loved being a mom. Being a mom is my favorite thing I've ever done. And that wasn't something that I went into it thinking, I'm going to be really good at this and I'm going to love it. I was just like, yeah, we'll have kids and hopefully it works out and, we're happy. But I just was so smitten with my daughter that I wanted to do it again.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anyone should have any judgment on anyone for the choices they
but
make when
people
it
do.
yeah.
I mean, there's so much judgment when it comes to family building. It's wild. And
Yeah.
that's what, I know that you're on the same, but like trying to eliminate the judgment and the stigmas and all that.
Yeah, and even myself, I don't have children by
Mhm.
choice, and there's that
Mhm.
stigma too.
Mhm.
Um, but I have a question. So with you and Vince, when you've gone through 4 miscarriages,
Mhm.
how did that and then the choice for IVF, and that's a
Mhm.
big choice.
Mhm.
How did that affect your marriage?
Oh my God. It was awful.
Yeah.
So, he and I grieve very differently. We realized
Mhm.
he and I also are not good in crisis. We're just not. Unfortunately, like some couples, who've gone through infertility have said, oh, it really drew us closer together. It made us stronger. For us, it was like it really ripped us apart. He was obviously very sad when we had our miscarriages, but I think after the third one, he was probably like, okay, enough.
Mhm.
Like he didn't want to see me going through that because I was just shattered. And I think that was hard for him to see me like that. And, I will say a little background on Vince. He's an only child
Mhm.
of two only children. So he
He's good.
knew like the only child life.
Yep.
And, we had Ever, our daughter. And I think he was like, okay, if she's going to be an only child, that's fine. And I have to say also, I have nothing against only children. He had a wonderful upbringing. His parents are wonderful. It just wasn't how I envisioned our family. I didn't want her to be an only child. I just wanted to have a big chaotic family,
Do you come
or
from
a bigger. I
do
do.
you
Yeah,
yeah,
I've
big
got,
family?
I'm one of five,
Yep.
including step siblings. My mom was one of five. My dad was one of seven. So tons of cousins, tons of aunts and uncles. I love that family chaos and tons of people being around. So,
Yeah.
he and I were definitely coming from different vantage points. And, it wasn't that he didn't want the second child, he did, but it was like at a certain point, I think he was ready to pivot. And I was still like, this is happening. And, we were in a really, really dark place. I saw him as like the opposition. Like, I was like, why are you not totally on board with this? Why are you pushing back? Like, I've already got enough obstacles in the way. Like, we should be teammates. And he was like, why are you doing this to us?
Mhm.
And, I both points are valid. And it's funny, like he on my podcast, the first episode is me telling my story. And then on the 100th episode, it's him telling his story. We had to have some drinks before we could like get into it. So like you can listen to it. We're like, you can hear us like opening beer cans, like
I
as
love it.
I'm interviewing him. But it's interesting because we had, even though we went through the same experience, we had two totally different experiences. So it was interesting to hear his point of view and his thoughts and why he was against it. Part of it was financial, and I get
Mhm.
that. None of this was covered by insurance for us. It was all out of
Right.
pocket. And anybody going through IVF or infertility treatments know it's expensive as hell. It's crazy expensive. Um, so that was part of it, was like he
Yeah.
was like, we don't really have the money right now to do this. And then I would be like, how can you put a price tag on a human life?
Mhm.
That
That's
was
what
my
I
argument. So it was bad. It was really fraught. And I was really emotional. And, talking about mental health and all that, I was feeling really insecure. I was feeling hormonal. My body had gone through 4 pregnancy losses. So it was like all over the place mentally. And it was just a really dark time. And I remember one time we were driving out to a friend's house. We were on the Long Island Expressway
Mhm.
and we were just in the biggest argument. And it was like, we hated each other. And I was like, are we going to make it? And he was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just like welled up thinking about that because it was so low. Like it was such a dark moment. And I was like, oh my God, we might not.
I think that's so important to point out too, and even with my husband, we have to agree, like, we have these 2 different thoughts and opinions and reasons of why we make certain choices. Neither are bad or malicious, but it's communicating about it and trying to understand each other. So did you guys end up going to therapy?
I did.
Yeah.
We ended up doing marriage couples therapy
Mhm.
like it was short-lived. It wasn't really our jam, but I
Yeah.
was definitely in therapy. And I will say my therapist helped me a lot, mentally come to the place where like, if you are a family of three, that's going to be okay. Like she
Yeah.
helped me kind of get to that into that headspace. That was right before I finally kind of got there right before we did our one and only, attempt at and one and only round of IVF. Where ultimately we did get really lucky and it worked and we had our son. But
So
yeah, it was just yeah, Vince and I were like just butting heads constantly. And it was like, we might break up over this. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to add was I remember looking at him and being like, I wish I didn't want this so badly because I know I'm like fucking everything up and it's all because of me wanting this, but I can't not want it. And that was
yeah.
really hard to wrap my head around because it was like my rational brain knew that it was like I was causing like so many problems, but my heart was like, but you have to do this, like that push and pull.
Yeah. So you decide to do IVF. Vince is
We
like, "All
did.
right,
Yeah.
let's do it."
It took a long, long time to get him to that point, and he even had to go in and talk to the doctor, and we had to, like, borrow money from his parents and my parents, And we agreed, like, we'll do 1 round.
Yeah.
This has gone on, it had been years at that point that we'd been trying. And it was like, well, we'll do 1 round. He's like, that's my compromise. If it doesn't work, we're closing this chapter and we're going to be happy as a family of 3. And I was like, okay, that's fair. So it took us a long time to get to that place.
So then you get there, but that's like years, at least 3 years of miscarriages, arguing,
Oh yeah.
stress,
Like the
this,
worst
like
sex
that
you've ever had too,
is
because it's so like
scheduled.
fraught and like, yeah, yeah,
Oh my God.
exactly. It
So,
was terrible.
but then you get to this decision, you're going to do it. And now you've already been through so much mentally. And then here you're going in and you're about to take, all these hormones.
hmm
So is there anything that you did to prep yourself to make sure you mentally, physically, you could handle this next step?
Yeah, such a good question. So I did, with infertility and with what was going on, I feel like there's so much that's out of your control.
Mhm.
We always talk about how it's one of those places where even if you do like quote unquote all the right things and you like check all the boxes and you follow all the rules, sometimes it still doesn't work. Which is really messed up. And it's really hard to grapple with that. It's like, I always equate it, this is a lame example, but studying for a test for like 2 weeks straight, pulling all-nighters and then getting an F. And it's like, but
Mhm.
I did all the things. And like that's just how infertility is. It's not a guarantee no matter what. It's a crapshoot. And even the doctors, will be like, sometimes, 1 round you'll do something and then it doesn't work. And the next round you'll do all the same things and it does work. And it's just like, there's so many factors that layer into it that there's just no guarantees.
Yeah.
Um, so, I think that's one of the hardest parts too, is just trying to figure that out, that it's not a guarantee.
Yeah. So that would be, so anyone listening, I think this is always good. Like, number one, how you mentally, physically prepped. That's a good tip, just knowing that there's no guarantee. And then what is even the process of IVF?
Yeah, good question. So the other thing I've tried to do in answer to your last question is just I tried to get into like the best shape that I
Mhm.
could. Like I was like working out a lot and trying to like just eat really clean and healthy and just making myself, because I was like, I can control these things, but I
Right.
can't control how the drugs are going to work. So what it entails, and again, everybody's different depending on what they're going through treatment wise and what their protocol was or is. So for me, it was, you get a box of drugs that are delivered in the mail. Mine got
Yes.
lost.
Oh, nice.
And I was like hyperventilating into a paper bag because I was supposed to start them that night.
And you have to
It's
start them like
everything's
then.
really timed.
Yeah.
They have to like monitor your cycles. I should backtrack and say, if you go see an REI, an infertility specialist, infertility doctor, they'll give you like a workup and they do usually like an ultrasound and see where you're at, like where your ovaries are and your egg reserve, and try to tell as much as they can before you start treatment. And then they'll come up with a protocol. So, you have to take you have to do a bunch of different shots and, it's all timed and, it can go anywhere from, like a week to longer. Like it depends, again, it depends on your cycle. But for me, I think it was about 7 days of the drugs. And then, you're gearing up for what's called an egg retrieval.
Mhm.
So, they're trying to like prime your body and produce as many healthy eggs, and stimulate your ovaries and your hormones, so that when you go in, the doctor can extract the eggs. So that's the egg retrieval. And then they watch them in a lab. They in vitro fertilization is, the long term of IVF, and in vitro, I think means like in a dish.
Mhm.
I could be wrong. I think it's like
I
Latin,
think
like
in vitro
in a
for
dish.
yeah.
So they're in like a petri dish, Um, but they watch your, they'll do that. They watch the eggs, and then the husband or partner, if you have one, will do like a sperm donation. And then you can create embryos. They'll take the healthy eggs and mix it with the sperm and try to create embryos. And then they watch the embryos and how those grow and progress over the course of the next like 7 days.
Oh,
So if you do have healthy embryos at the end of it, and then the other step, which is optional, which costs more money,
mhm.
is getting them tested. I did at the time, I think it's called PGT testing now. which just means they're going to go in and, take a little bit of the embryo, do like a biopsy and make sure that
It's healthy or
it's a healthy
yeah.
embryo and you've got all the chromosomes. It's like a chromosome test mainly. And then if it's you get the results. And if it comes back healthy, that your embryos have all the chromosomes they're supposed to have, then those embryos are deemed, good enough to do a transfer.
And at that
And
time,
then
is that when you can choose, like, find out if it's a boy or girl if you want to?
you can,
Yeah,
yes, they can tell the gender at that point.
yeah, that's wild.
Again, I have to say, like, I'm definitely not a scientist or a doctor,
Yeah.
so if any of this is wrong and there's a fact checker out there, I apologize. This is how it was for me.
Yeah,
Everybody's experience is different. Like, always check with your doctor. Don't go exactly by what I'm
exactly.
saying.
Yeah.
Disclaimer. Um, but yeah, so yes, you can tell the gender if you want to. And then there's a couple different ways you could do either a fresh transfer, which means, a couple days later they will implant the embryo, or you can do a frozen transfer, which is what I did. So that basically our choice, my doctor and, us and our medical team decided like, they wanted to freeze the embryos, make sure that like my body was kind of going back, like got hormonally like a little more balanced, and then they would do the transfer. And in my circumstance, he felt like that was going to be a better scenario for me to possibly get pregnant and for the embryo to implant. So that's what we did. And that means you have to wait like another month, which is like there's a lot of waiting in infertility treatments. There's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of things getting canceled and testing. And if this test doesn't go a certain way, you might have to wait for it to be better the next month. It's so complicated and it's really, really hard.
So in all of this waiting and possibly longer and longer, was there any tools that you had to find the calm in all of this while you're on all the hormones, while you've gone through
Right.
years of all of this? What did you do?
I'm such a like community person
Mhm,
and I've always craved, community and I love talking about stuff. That's why I started the podcast
mhm.
later. That's why I started Fertility Rally, which is my community that I co-founded, with people that are going through this. But to be honest, I didn't have any of that really when I was there. And that's
Mhm,
part of the
that's
reason I
why.
created them later. I wish I would have had a community that
Mhm.
I could have gone to a support group a couple times a week virtually and talked about what I was going through. I just mainly tried to talk to my friends about it, but it was kind of like a lot of it was internal for me, and
Yeah.
that was hard.
Well, then good for you for starting a community and having a safe place. What's the community name again?
It's called Fertility Rally.
Where do you
We started in 2020, and
yeah.
it's basically for anybody who's going through not just, IVF, obviously, but any sort of family building through assisted reproductive technology, which is, the science behind all this stuff. We have some same-sex couples in our group. We have single parents by choice. So, anybody's welcome. It's basically like if you're in this world at all in any way,
I hear
join
you.
the group, talk to people who get it.
Yeah.
We've got like private Facebook groups and we do 5 to 6 support groups a week and we've got events and it's basically just people coming together that know, what's going on. We call it the worst club with the best members because it's nobody wants to be here, but everybody who's here is like really wonderful and everybody's like coming from a place of love.
That's amazing. And so that goes into a question I had. Your best advice. What is your best advice to a friend, a loved one who has not gone through infertility, um, and how they can support their a friend or loved one that is going
Yeah.
through infertility?
It's so hard because, if you haven't gone through it, you really don't know the depths of
Mhm,
like the mental part of it and the depression that can come
mhm.
about. I think that one bit of advice is try to refrain from saying like, well, at least you got pregnant if you had a miscarriage, or like, at least we know you can get
Good.
pregnant, or at least anything I feel like is really tricky and kind of triggering for people who are
Mhm.
going through infertility. Cause it's like, I don't want to hear that. Like, I'm doing all the things. Like, don't, you know, and I know people are coming, it's tricky too, because people are coming from a good place
Yeah.
and you want to give them grace and people mean well. But I do think that's something to kind of try to avoid. Also, just saying, I love you. Even if you don't know what to say, being like, I don't know what to say, but I love you and I'm listening and I'm here for you. Your pain is valid, things like that. Just recognizing that it is something that's really hard to go through, I think is important.
Is there yeah, I always say that. I get that question a lot on how can you support a loved one who has a family member who has a mental illness, but you have
Right.
no experience because even when I got married, my husband was like, "What is mental illness?" And then having to educate
Yeah.
himself about my mother. And
Right. Right.
and I know, are there support groups? I feel like there probably are, or maybe even in your group, or just people who want the answers. Because Bobby, my husband, and I went
Mm-hmm.
to a support group called Family to Family through NAMI,
Mm-hmm.
which was educating what mental illness is, how you support. It's all for family members who have a loved one with a mental illness,
Yes.
so that they can learn, have empathy, understand what the family member is going through. And it was a 13-week course that we went to together, and it like yeah,
Wow.
it helped us, and it was helpful to our marriage as well to make sure that we're both educated on how to support each other and talk to each other,
Yeah.
support the family member. So I don't know
That's
if
amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, so our groups, like I said, anybody is welcome. If people who are members want to bring a family member, we do sometimes do like a one-off, like bring your, partner or bring your mom or, your sister or your best friend. We do a lot of those in our groups. We also do Fertility Rally Live twice a year, which is a free event for anybody. And
Mm,
that's, I think, a good place where people can have their like loved ones come or their friends come because it's just a virtual event of speakers and it's people who have gone through like a whole bunch of different things. So we'll have like a keynote speaker, like we had Tara Lipinski or we had the
wow,
singer Christina Perry recently. And then
so
we have like a
fun.
lot of breakout sessions where people can come and get more information. We usually do like a doctor's panel where three prominent doctors answer tons of different questions from the audience, or just things that people have submitted in advance on Instagram. We do like a couples panel, so it's just that's a good way to go and be a voyeur if you're not in this world to just kind of get more understanding about what your loved one might be going through. So I encourage anybody check that out. Fertility Rally Live. We do it every October and April. And it's free. And then the content is online. And if you get a ticket, again, it's free, but you have 90 days to watch everything. So it's not even like you have to be there like right when the event is happening.
That is incredible what you're doing. I've
Yeah.
never heard anything like
Oh,
this.
thank you. You
Um,
should come.
I know.
Be
I'm
a part of it, actually.
I just love
We'll talk. We'll talk.
learning, educating, and
Yeah, clearly.
normalizing. Like, what do you think the biggest stigma for infertility is that you're trying to break?
There's so many, but the biggest one, I guess, is just that it's something that isn't like a medical diagnosis, that
Yeah.
it's like a choice. If someone's going through IVF, they're most likely doing it because they have to. It's not because they want to. And I'm saying that because even before I got into the world, I've said this a lot of times, but I thought IVF was for people that like wanted to have multiples or like,
Mhm.
didn't like wanted to get pregnant like in an interesting way and figure out the gender of their baby or whatever. Like, I didn't know that it was something that people needed to do because they weren't able to get pregnant otherwise or have babies otherwise.
Yeah.
Um,
I think I
so
looked at it that way years and years ago too. Like it was, "Oh, I'm
yeah,
gonna do IVF." Not really, because
right,
no one knew that that's because there was trouble.
right.
Yeah.
And I also think there's a stigma that it's just for like rich white people, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
And, part of the reason that that stigma exists is because it's really cost prohibitive for people and a lot of, insurance companies don't cover it. But I've had so many people, women of color and families of color. I had this amazing couple on my podcast recently, the Burrows. And they were in the infertility world because he has sickle cell and the medicine that he'd been taking his whole life affected his sperm quality, and that's how they found themselves in the infertility world. So I think the stigma that it only happens to a certain subset of people or a certain demographic. Um, my good friend, I won't even say her name here, but just I don't want to misquote her, but a good
Yeah.
friend of mine, a woman of color, was saying like, people think, oh, they say to her, and I'm quoting her, like, "Oh, as a woman of color, like, you're so fertile, like, you're supposed to be fertile, you know, you
Mm.
shouldn't have." And it's hard for, her, she was saying, to talk about infertility because it's just not as accepted in that,
Mhm.
even in their own community. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? So I think it's just the stigma that, like, infertility doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you're a big celebrity and you've got all the money in the world or not, you know, the opposite. Like, it's just something that unfortunately affects so many people. And I wish that people would, again, stop being judgmental and stop trying to kind of like pigeonhole people that are going through it.
Yeah. Well, and your podcast started in 2019?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how many conversations have you had with
Oh
couples
my
that are
gosh.
going through it?
Well, there's been, let's see, there's been almost 300 episodes of the show. Um, and I don't know how many couples I've had on,
Yeah.
exactly, but many. And then, you know,
Or
factoring in the Fertility Rally Live people that I've
yeah.
interviewed and all the couples who are like members of Fertility Rally, definitely hundreds.
Yeah. And that's only the tip. We're talking
So
15 million people a year.
I know, it's so true. You know, and it's funny because people say, like, is that number getting bigger because more people are talking about it or because
Mhm.
more people are actually experiencing infertility because of all the different factors, environmental, having kids later in life, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know the answer to that. It's probably a combination, you know?
Yeah. I don't know the answer either, but I would
Yeah,
assume so, but I have no clue. So,
right.
I want to have a fun conversation working at
Ooh,
Playboy.
oh my God.
When
Okay,
I
yes.
you're like casually on your podcast, you're like, "Oh yeah, I used to be what were you, an editor at Playboy?"
Yeah, I was yes, I worked there for 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
It was the best job.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
So what did you do?
So
Like
I started, okay, so this is crazy. The reason that I got my job there, which was wild, was I wrote a letter. I was a journalism major at University of Illinois in Champaign. Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy,
Mhm.
went to the same college. And there actually was a scholarship in the journalism department called the Hugh Hefner Magazine Scholarship. And your professors nominated you for that if you were in the journalism school. And one of my professors nominated me, and I won the scholarship. Um, and so I was like, "Ooh, I'm gonna use this as an entree to like write a letter to Hef." So, and this is like, this is how old I am. This is pre-email. Like it was like right before email was a thing. So when I was in college. So I wrote him like a snail mail, typed it out on like a brother word processor letter and was like, "Hey, Hugh Hefner, like I won your scholarship. I love your magazine." Cause I actually did read Playboy. Vince, my boyfriend at the time, had a subscription to it and, like, I would read all the Playboy interviews, and I remember there was one with Cindy Crawford, and it was really interesting,
I
and
mean,
I've always loved interviewing people, so
yeah, I remember Playboy guys subscribed because they had
yeah,
really great articles.
articles, totally, exactly. So, I wrote this letter to Hef, and I said, "I don't know if you have internship or interns, but I'd love to work for you." And sure enough, he got the letter. I sent it to him in LA. I was in, the burbs of Chicago at the time or Southern Illinois. And Playboy headquarters were in Chicago. So all of a sudden I'm at college and one of my roommates, we get a phone call again, not on a cell phone, it was on our landline. I sound like I'm from like the 1800s. I was
No,
like,
we're
the
probably the same. I mean, the amount of
stagecoach drove up.
the amount of
Um,
times I made so many cool things happen. I'm like, and I faxed them something
totally. Oh my God,
and got
faxes.
hired on a
Do you
job.
remember microfiche? Where
No,
you would
okay.
like go to the library and look something up on microfiche and it
I
would like give you like a brain. Okay, whatever.
I don't know that one.
All right, Google it.
Okay.
Um, so anyway, I got a phone call. My roommate's like, "Allie, Hugh Hefner's assistant's on the phone for you." Like they called me in college. And I get on the phone. She's like, "Hi, honey. This is Mary O'Connor, Hef's assistant. Hef got your letter and really enjoyed it. And we'd love to have you come into the Chicago office for an interview." And I was like, "Holy shit." Like it worked. So I went in and interviewed with the editorial director, this guy, Arthur Kretschmer, who ended up hiring me to be an intern for 6 months. And I ended up staying for 10 years.
Wow, that's cool.
Um, it was awesome. So yeah, I was an editor there. I was one of the music editors. I did a lot of the, college articles. I did a lot of the Playmate stuff. I ended up working closely with Hef on like all of his like party pages where we would like go to the parties and then write these little captions. And it was awesome. It was for like someone in their 20s.
Oh, yeah.
It was like so much fun. And magazines were really big then. So they had lots of
Huge.
money. And I'd be like
Mhm.
going all over the place and going on these cool interviews and adventures. And it was great. It was a really, really good time.
Oh, fun. So then after you left Playboy, where did your career take you next?
Yeah, so I stayed in magazines. That's the reason. So we were living in Chicago, and that's part of the reason that, or the main reason we moved to New York is because the headquarters of Playboy got transferred from Chicago to New York. So we came here. Vince and I were married by then, newly married. And that's part of the reason it all comes back to the fertility stuff is,
Yeah.
I was about to turn 30 and all my kids in Chicago, or all my friends in Chicago were starting to have babies. And I was like, we can't have babies now. We're like moving to a new city. We don't even know how to ride the subway. Like, I can't have a baby.
Mhm.
So we put it off. And I think
Yeah.
that was ultimately one of those like sliding doors moments in
Yeah.
life that like, your life goes this way. And had that not happened, I don't know if I would have found myself in the infertility world.
Yeah. So then, okay, you go to New York and
Yeah.
you're back in magazines.
Yes, stayed at Playboy, and then I worked at a whole bunch of other magazines, and then I became freelance writer, still, writing about people and stuff, and then ultimately, like, that's how I started the podcast was because I was like, "I want people talking about this stuff, but, nobody is," but I love, like, telling people stories and interviewing
Yeah.
people, so then years later, that's where the podcast came out.
Amazing. I like to always get like the flow of
Like
people's
the
lives and like how
Yeah,
it changes. And, for me being a triathlete transitioning into founding one of the top fitness companies, Tone It Up for
yeah,
15 years, but then my passion for mental health and I love podcasting because I get to meet cool people like you. And now I
thanks,
have
back at you.
friends all over the world through it.
Isn't it
And
cool? I
yeah.
know.
And you get to learn so much. You get to share stories. You get to help people's lives. But I do like that transition. And that's another stigma I want to end too is the transition of, or the stigma of making transitions in life and
Mm,
making those different choices and not always have to staying in that certain pocket or bucket that
yeah,
people know you for.
yeah. That's so interesting that you say that because I was just talking to Vince about that the other day. Was like we were laughing. I'm like, who would have thought that, like, starting out in Playboy and now I'm like in the fertility world. Like I never would have guessed that I would be, working and my passion would be here and creating all these different things. I think that for me, it's just a lot of it has just been following, like, your heart and, like, the through line, I will say, of, like, my whole career, though, that does make sense is, like, I've always loved storytelling, and I've
Hmm.
always loved, like you said, sharing people's stories, and I truly believe change happens through storytelling, by making people feel less alone and by being like, "I did that too," and here's something embarrassing that happened to me, or here's something terrible that happened to me, or here's something amazing that happened to me.
Hmm.
You can connect with people, and it just makes people be like, "Oh, okay, well, I
Yeah.
can talk about that too."
Yeah.
Um, so I think, it's hard though, like jumping from magazines to being an entrepreneur and a founder and starting my own thing. Part of it was just like ignorance is bliss, I think. It was
Yeah.
like, had I thought about it more and had I like talked myself out of it, I would be like, oh, I'm not going to do that. But I just kind of do things and make these transitions. Um, Being like, what do I need now? Or what's missing in the world that I think I can put out there? I wrote this children's book about IVF
Hmm.
called Work of Art, and it's about, me telling my son how he was born and it came out earlier this year. And it's the same thing with the book. It was like, had I known how hard it was going to be and like how
They're
much of a
hard.
hustle and like I self-published it,
Yeah.
it's been an awesome experience, but like I think sometimes not knowing and not risk assessing
Yeah.
everything has worked for me because it's like you can freak yourself out if you think about all the like ins and outs of it. But like once you're in it, you're like, well, we're gonna figure it out.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice. And I'm the same way. I'm like, I'm going to do this. And Bobby will be like, okay, you can do anything. And
Right.
then you just got
Yes.
to say yes to
Have you
something.
found that too? Like, you
Yeah.
just kinda dive in sometimes and you just figure it out as you're going?
Everything. Even
Yeah.
founding Tone It Up, we like didn't go to business school. It wasn't really a business.
Right.
We just started doing it. And with Big Silence, I'm just like, there's a need. I'm going to figure it out.
I love that.
Writing a
That's
book.
awesome.
I thought I could write. It was the third book because my first two were fitness and wellness. Third one is like, I'm going to write this in a year. Took 5 years, but that's okay.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
it's okay.
Right.
So, all right, where can we find you? We're going to put everything in the show notes,
Okay.
but
Um,
best place to
Yeah.
find you, and especially your support group, everything that you're
Yeah.
doing.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just have to say, like,
Yep.
you're such a natural podcaster because your curiosity is real authentic,
Oh,
like, and I
thank you.
think that makes for someone to have a good conversation. Like, you really have great questions because you really want to know the answers. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that comes through with everybody. So
I
kudos to you for
appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But yes, if people want to find me, Instagram is where I do most of my stuff for the podcast Infertile AF Stories. You can go there. The podcast is on all the platforms. It's called Infertile AF. It's totally free, obviously, like all podcasts. But you can find it on Apple and Spotify and all the things. Fertility Rally is the community. If anybody is listening and has questions or wants to, become a member or check out a group before they commit to anything, I'm happy to have someone come as my guest. So just reach out to me, again, on Instagram at Infertile AF Stories or Instagram at Fertility Rally. And then our website is fertilityrally.com. And then for the book and all my things combined is infertileafgroup.com. That's my website. So if people want to check out work of art, my children's book, that's there. You can also link to the podcast there. You can also link to Fertility Rally there. So lots of different ways. I'm also like on LinkedIn and TikTok and all that stuff. So
You're busy.
DMs are open. Anybody can, I'm happy to talk to people. I know how hard it is. And if anybody's going through something and feels alone, like, please know that you're not. And, if you want to talk to me, I'm around. If you need resources, I can point you in the right direction. I just basically want to make it less shitty for
Yeah.
anybody coming after me because it was so bad and so hard, so pulling people up behind you, I think, is a really good way to go through life once you've gone through something really hard.
Yeah, I love that. And I just had a question pop up about your podcast because I feel like it's not talked about enough. Do you have a conversation on your pod about postpartum depression?
Let's see. I'm sure it has come up.
Yeah.
Definitely. One thing that we do talk about, which is interesting, is and goes in the, under the umbrella of postpartum, I would say, is like pregnancy and motherhood after loss, because there's a lot of like guilt there sometimes when you've gone through like an infertility journey. For example, you've wanted this baby so badly, you've tried so hard, you've paid all this money, you've done all the things, and then you're like, the baby comes and you're elated, but you're also like, I don't feel as great as I thought I was going to, or I'm having trouble, and you almost feel like you can't complain because of everything you've gone through. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
think that's a postpartum angle that we do talk about a lot.
All right.
Is
So
like
anyone go to the links in
Yes.
the show notes. All the things are there.
All the links.
You're not alone. Thank
Never.
you, Allie, for coming
Thank
on
you
the Big
so much.
Silence.
And again, thanks for what you're doing and all the things you're talking about. It's so important. So thank you for having me.
The Big Silence. The Big Silence.